really interested in intergenerational storytelling, intergenerational relationships, but also intergenerational violence and the way that things that happen in one generation get passed down in a variety of ways to those that come afterwards.
Welcome to the Skiffy and Fanty Show.
And then the tiger spoke. Starving the beast, at the very least, will just increase its hunger. Go right ahead and starve me dead. It will only make me stronger. The lady said, Felines and dames in flames will hardly serve my aims, but in my dreams, it seems, that my eyes are always shooting laser beams. Behind one door, a muffled roar. Behind the other, a voice. The hall remains. It still contains a pair of doors. A choice.
Nice. There's a lot of rhyming in there, which is fun. I'm Sean.
I'm Daniel.
And tonight we are joined by World Fantasy Award-winning writer Helen Marshall. Welcome to the show, Helen.
Hey everyone. Thanks very much for having me.
So Helen Marshall is the acclaimed author of the dark fantasy horror collection Gifts for the One Who Comes After and Hairside Fleshside, the novel The Migration, and two poetry collections, Skeleton Leaves and The Sex Lives of Monsters. Gosh, that is a wonderful title. Today, we're here to talk to Helen about her new novel, The Lady, the Tiger, and the Girl Who Loved Death, out now from Titan Books. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Me too, because this is going to be fun.
Before we get into our discussion, a reminder to our listeners to please share your questions and comments with us at skiffyandfanty.com/listener suggestions. If you aren't already, join us on Twitch for Sean's Alphabet streams every Friday at 7 p.m. Central to be a part of our interactive live streaming show format. Finally, please be sure to review and spread the word about our show, help support us through our Patreon, and be a part of our Torture Cinema polls, live watches, and other special Patreon-only events on Discord. And we now have a pay-what-you-want Patreon model, so you could join in all of that for as little as $1 a month.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so let's start with the kind of big starter question, which is, Helen, why don't you tell us a little bit about The Lady, the Tiger, and the Girl Who Loved Death?
I'm really happy to do that. So my novel's set in an imaginary Eastern European country where magic meets revenge, and there's a circus that holds the power over life and death. So the novel follows 17-year-old Arenda, who after the death of her parents in a state-sponsored bombing is forced to live with her grandmother, Sarah, who's a woman who's rumored to be a witch. But Sarah has an extraordinary secret, which is that there is a mystical beast at the center of the universe that can help her granddaughter master death. So at the heart of the novel is this circus like no other, where illusion and reality blur, and it's there that Arenda's remarkable abilities catch the eye of a ruthless government official named Victor with an agenda of his own. And so on this stage where spectacle and politics and power collide, Arenda has to choose whether she's going to serve Victor and his masters, or if she's going to risk everything to defy them. That's my book.
Oh boy, there's a lot. Okay. So I want us to start actually with the thing that leapt out to me literally from the first page, which is the tense that you use. There's present tense right from the start. And then there is a sort of unique shift that takes place in the point of view, where it sort of is the present tense, reads as third person, and then moves to a you second person kind of style because of the way the narrative is structured. And I was kind of curious about, trying to weave together what to me seemed like really complicated different ways of telling story and moving between, in some cases, like a narrative that is its own sort of narrative as a story being told, and then the individuals having a conversation about the narrative that is happening. And I guess the question I would ask is, how did you kind of balance this, and what were you kind of hoping to achieve narratively about all of these different ways of telling this story?
Well, I knew that I wanted the novel to be a novel about storytelling. And I have to say, I went through about 20 drafts of the novel that experimented with loads and loads of different point of view styles and approaches. So at one stage, there were conversations that were just interjections, and there was kind of no narrative scaffolding around them. Gradually, I built up the frame narrative, and I teach creative writing. And one of the things I say to my students often is do a lot of experimenting with your narrative point of view, sort of with your first chapter or so, because what you don't want to do is actually go through multiple drafts of the entire novel where you're going and revising the entire tense. Because I think I must have done that 2 or 3 times where I shifted tenses throughout. So structurally, it's quite a complicated novel with characters telling each other stories with a frame narration, which scaffolds how that's done. But it took me a long time to build towards a sort of workable version of that, which I hope is where I've landed with a workable version. Yeah, it is a complicated structure.
It struck me from your response, but also as I was reading it and having read some of your previous work, including short stories and The Migration, that your writing of this may have in some ways sort of paralleled the journey of your protagonists in terms of being encouraged to like take a risk and go in unexpected ways. Because though this book seemed familiar to me in terms of your style and particularly in the language and the lyricism of it all, the beauty of the language I thought was there, which reminded me of what I've read from your previous work, but the structure seemed really ambitious and very different from anything that you've done that I've read before. And so was that the case? Did you find yourself like wanting to take creative writing risks as you were doing this compared to previous work?
Yeah, so I was writing The Migration, which was my first novel that's set in the present, very linear. As it was my first novel, I'd written 2 collections of short stories beforehand. I found it quite difficult, as some short story writers do, to move from short story writing to novel writing. And I found writing in a linear style in present tense, I found it sort of tension that I found really restrictive, which was useful for creating a clear plot that followed all the way through. But after I finished writing that novel, I remember saying to myself, I said, I'm going to kind of try to do what I do in my short stories in a novel form. And I'm just going to go crazy and do whatever I want. And I did that for the first draft, and I just had the most fun I think I've ever had while I was writing. I'm just going to let myself do whatever I want here, and then I'm going to find a way to clean it up. And in some ways, it was overly ambitious in that it took me a long, long time to work my way to cleaning it up properly. But it came out of this desire to actually break the pattern that I had found myself in The Migration, and to try to move around initially from different character perspectives. So the original draft of the novel, rather than following, it still followed Arenda's storyline all the way through, but had different, more prominent viewpoint characters, which I ended up streamlining over multiple drafts. But that was part of a desire to break out of this simpler form of writing I had found a little bit too restrictive to work through in long form.
That is interesting that to some degree this novel then was like a kind of big challenge, which may explain also why you'd mentioned so many different drafts and kind of having some, I imagine, false starts or things that just didn't quite work and going through the revision phase. And I guess I want to ask really here more of a like writing question. Compared to your other work, did you find that a lot of the sort of final product really kind of came out of kind of tearing it apart in the revision process? And did you enjoy that process, I guess would be the other part of that question.
I think I did for the most part. I think the most challenging part of it was that when I did the final couple of drafts of the novel, I was really heavily pregnant, and trying to manage a complicated novel structure and also growing human life at the same time was quite a lot. And what I found most enjoyable, I think, about the final couple of drafts when I had moved everything into Arenda's perspective was I could rewrite my way quite simply through previous material that I'd already covered through other viewpoint characters. And it was a little bit like writing fan fiction about my own novel. I just got to kind of sit in this character's world and flesh it out a little bit and develop character relationships and sometimes introduce new characters who hadn't quite been there and weave them all the way through. And so I think rather than finding it frustrating at that final phase, I actually found it really liberating because I felt like I knew the story so well that that I was just playing in the world.
That's so interesting. You saw it as almost like writing fan fiction of your own characters, which is interesting given that the story itself is people telling stories to each other, in some cases quite literally about aspects of their own past history. And so there is like a almost, I mean, I don't think that the novel necessarily reads in that specific way, but it, like, from a conceptual sense, right, the novel is almost like we're telling kind of a fan story of our own history, as it were, which is, I never really thought about that till this moment, but it's kind of breaking my brain.
Did the circular...
I think
Go ahead.
Go ahead, sorry.
I think that there's something in that style of narration that probably is a bit closer to my short stories, because one of the things I really like doing in a short story is having a narrative voice, which is like, I'm going to sit down and tell you a story, which I think is often really compelling in the short story form. So some of what I was playing with was that style, which actually seems very natural to me, which is, let me tell you a story.
Almost like campfire, like telling a story around the campfire. Normally we would tell scary stories, although there are aspects of this that are a scary story, I suppose. But it has that very God, what is the word for? I just think of campfire stories, but that way that people will like sit down with their kids and tell a story. It has that, but obviously more sophisticated prose, because most of my grandmothers tell us kids stories involve like frogs saving princes and things of that nature, which is a very different kind of thing than here.
I often think about it like Stephen King's novels. I don't think that the style of this is particularly Stephen King. There's something that I really admire about the way that Stephen King writes, where you just feel as if you've sidled up next to somebody at a bar and they're just going to tell you a story, and they're charming. Maybe they're kind of avuncular, but they're just interesting to listen to. And so you want to stick with them as they're telling you about their life or something that happened to them.
Yeah, that would be my experience with reading The Shining for the first time. Very engrossed in the way that he told that story, despite knowing how effectively it was going to end. For some reason, I had to just keep reading, which, yeah, I like The Shining. People should read it.
Here, though, it evoked sort of that familial storytelling, like learning the history of your family because of the nature of the characters, and you have... Because of where things are set, both in realities and different time points and sort of a liminal zone in between life and death or between things, you have times where it's grandmother talking to granddaughter or granddaughter talking to grandmother, and sometimes the granddaughter's much older than the grandmother, right? And so it's playing with time in really cool, interesting ways, and how stories are told across generations, and creating sort of a cyclical nature to things. And I know that's a big theme or something that appears in the novel, is sort of the cyclical things that repeat in the stories of the grandmother and the granddaughter. And was that also in from the very beginning of how you were first developing this novel, even in the earliest drafts? Or did that spring from the sort of writing the fan fiction of these characters that you began to pull similarities between different points in life?
I think that some of it was always there right from the start, because I was really interested in intergenerational storytelling, intergenerational relationships, but also intergenerational violence, and the way that things that happen in one generation get passed down in a variety of ways to those that come afterwards. So I think that there's something quite interesting about the way that Arenda as granddaughter can hear her grandmother's story, but also Arenda is telling her own story to her grandmother. And even though these people are sort of existing in the same space at times or sharing points of their life, they still have parts of their life that are actually kind of completely discrete from one another, and yet still manage to have an effect on one another. That to me seems really interesting in the way we think about what family is. And, I think about my relationship to my parents and my grandchildren, and now to my child as well, that we have discrete identities that bump into each other. can also shape each other in ways that we expect, but also ways that we don't expect at all. So some of that was purposefully there in the beginning. There were sections of it, I think, that took me by surprise. So when Sarah, the grandmother, tells her own story of what happened to her, I didn't know entirely what was in that story the first time I wrote it, and I think of all of the sections that I revised, that was the one that I probably revised the least. There was something about it that sort of came out fully formed, and much of the novel actually kind of ended up pivoting around it. But I often find that that's the case in my writing, is that, when I wrote The Migration, I think that was similarly about 20 drafts as well. So there was something about me making the shift from short story writing to novel writing and working out novel structure that took some time to do. And it is beginning to go much, much faster than that. I will often find these anchor scenes or anchor chapters or characters. And once I have those, then the rest of the novel gets kind of closer and closer and closer to those things.
It's interesting you bring up, because this is now, I think, the second time during this interview you've kind of mentioned the shift from the short story to the novel. And this is a pretty meaty novel. I mean, it's not like a gigantic, you can't hit someone over the head with it like a brick. It's not quite that big, but it's 400 something pages. And even if you're writing like a novella, which might be just barely over 100 pages, that's a pretty big leap. And so I guess I kind of would interrogate like historically, this is a thing that happens in genre fiction, right? Where people would write short fiction and then they'd like go write a novella and then they would like write a novel, but that novel would be like a Philip K. Dick 220 pages, which seems less daunting than, moving to something that's 400 plus pages. So something is in there about the shift in the form. It's not just the scale, but it's maybe also the amount of threads, or I guess kind of getting you to maybe tease out what you kind of think is that shift that makes it sometimes quite difficult.
I think about this quite a lot. One of the differences I find between short stories and novels is the way that scenes work. And that was what took me some time to figure out in my first novel. Is short story scenes, you can have a scene that's entirely about mood, or a scene that's a little, entirely about character, and it doesn't need to be about plot. Or you can have a story that pivots entirely on a 2-sentence scene that allows it to execute this kind of hard right. But novels are like ships with very, very large turning radiuses. And so everything you have to do kind of slowly and a bit more methodically. And so the scenes themselves have a very different feeling to them. So for me, that was part of the difference, is figuring out how to write scenes as a novelist rather than as a short story writer. And I think that the other thing is that when a short story writer moving to writing novels often thinks, how do I make things longer? And initially you think, oh, one way to make things longer is to put in more characters. But what you realize is, like, adding another character often doesn't, say, double, like, it's exponential growth. And that takes quite a lot of trimming and paring and figuring out a structure and figuring out how do you condense things back down again. So whereas I think you can do some of those moves again quite easily as a short story writer, because you always have this container that allows you to cut off points of inquiry. The reader doesn't ask as many questions of a short story because the short story is suddenly over, and then the reader is sort of left trying to grapple with it. Whereas the sheer length of a novel gives all of this time for the reader to ask questions, and as a result, knowing that they're asking questions, you have to be answering at the same time as you're going.
Yeah, you're making me think a lot about the very beginning of this book, which I think is a little complex because there's an element of not quite knowing exactly what's happening. I mean, you've got the clear images of, there's this opening chapter where she's effectively like seeking out her death, essentially. But there's a lot of sort of weird mystical elements that are happening where she meets like this giant tiger and the sisters, and then that sorts of unweaves. And you do this really interesting thing that I don't know if you did this on purpose, but those early chapters, literally the very first chapter is one line. And then after that, it's like a couple pages and then a couple pages and a couple pages. And then eventually it sort of opens up into sort of what we might think of as like more normal chapter lengths, if that makes sense. And I don't know if that was intentional or if that was just kind of the way your story naturally ramped up into that larger narrative. But it felt like it was sort of this slow opening that sort of then burst at one point.
Oh, it's really interesting to hear the process of that described. I think it was certainly intentional by the end of it, in that I knew from the start that I wanted to introduce the idea of the Palace of Stories in this place where they're sharing stories before I moved into Irenda's main storyline, which is the first storyline that you get, which is beginning to tell a longer story in a more novelistic form, if you will. But I wanted enough of a discrete sense of who Sarah, the grandmother, is when she's a young girl right at the beginning, to be able to give a sense of the stakes of what's going on. But again, I think that the way that the frame narrative worked went through several evolutions to get to where it is.
That the frame narrative both kind of gears you up for that settling down for a story to be told to you, and a conversation of stories between the characters and seeing that. And then similarly, the end of the frame, right? The end, you have that wind down period, really, where everything kind of settles, but then also it connects back to the original, of course. And so I think that framework works exceptionally well, particularly in establishing what this world is, how it's working, what these characters exist in, both mentally and physically, and giving a timelessness to it all. The novel draws a lot from folklore, I know, which I personally am not that familiar with Russian folklore or Eastern European folklore that this is drawing from, so I'm hoping you could say a little bit about that. But I did really enjoy the timelessness kind of feeling you get from the novel that is reminiscent of folklore that, you mentioned this taking place in sort of a fictional country, but it's almost like a country that seems very recognizable, particularly to somebody living in the US right now, but then also it feels somewhat historical and antiquated, and the words that you use often seem from something in the past, but then at other times you get things dropped in terms of technology or something that's like, oh no, this is present day, or this is maybe even, future society. And so you kind of get unearthed of where this is all occurring and such, in really fascinating, magical ways, that, again, really harken to folklore to me. So I was hoping you'd be able to say a little more about that aspect.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So the setting for the novel was inspired by Russia in the 1980s, but also contemporary Russia as well. And one of the things that I found really interesting about studying Russia as a setting is the way that you can have a sense of what we would think of as almost kind of historical epochs that are coexisting at the same time. So you'd have something like an ultra-modern city or capital, while in the peripheral villages, you still get something that is far more remote, maybe far more steeped in folklore. And that there's a weird sense of disconnect, I think, even within the culture between those things that we would think about as actually belonging to different times. And it's less that they belong to different times and actually more that they belong to different places or different versions of place. And what I wanted to do was try to I think that the fairy tale element allows me to bind that together and give it a kind of coherence that actually can feel kind of incoherent, even though it does exist in reality. And I found that I was searching for a language, a style of writing that would allow me to have some elements that are big or slightly formed, stylized, that would then not be able to place it so specifically in time at moments.
That's really interesting, because I definitely picked up on, and I had to do some research when I was reading this, because I was like, what is the folklore? Because Baba Yaga came up, and I was like, okay, that I know, right? Like I've heard that before. And then I started doing like little bits of just quick Google research, because folklore is also not my area of expertise, but I wanted to know where this is kind of pulling from to get a sense of place. And so I had a similar experience as Daniel, where the sense of place doesn't feel like grounded in any very particular thing, but seems to sort of weirdly still evoke a sense of groundedness, which is like a weird contradiction in my mind that I don't know how to make sense of. Because at the same time, I could recognize I'm not in a place that literally exists at this moment, but yet I felt like I was in a place that exists at this moment, if that made sense. And so this started actually because, if I'm correct, when Sarah names or names the tiger at the very beginning, I believe she says Amba is the name she gives it. And I was like, okay, I'm going to Google that. I got to figure out what this Amba thing is. And it led me to, okay, that's what gave me the sense of like how far east some of this might be drawing from, because apparently there is a movie about a Siberian tiger named Amba that like some nature documentarian like hunted down to find to take pictures of. And there's like a whole documentary about this guy doing this. And then I was like, okay, but like, why is it named Amba? Where does that word come from? And that gave me more stuff, which is, I guess, in some Slavic languages, that means mother. And then I don't know how true this is, but the internet told me, so it may be wrong. But it also might mean tiger in the Nanai language, which is the people from there's like an ethnic indigenous group in sort of like the Siberia where it kind of gets near where China is, which you're nodding. So I assume like, yes, some of that was correct. I realize I don't have a question. I just really want to tell you like what your book did to me. So.
Well, that was a really interesting thing as well, because I wrote a series of short stories that was me experimenting with bits of the setting that I was playing. Area around Siberia where tigers are common is really interesting, because we often think about Siberia really snowy. But there's all sorts of microclimates in the area, so it can move between that kind of snowy, almost Arctic kind of microclimate to, as it gets closer towards parts of China, towards almost subtropical. And you can have them overlapping and kind of actually in quite close proximity to each other. And I remember at one stage, one of my good friends was reading a short story, there's something really weird that's happening here, that you're mashing up these different locations. And in fact, I wasn't making that up. That was kind of just writing out of the research that I was doing at the time. And so we often tend to think about areas as being discrete, but I'm really interested in the liminal spaces where they overlap and you can kind of shift from one to the other.
I think that's also really important, is giving a sense of, I think we have, you kind of make this point earlier where you were talking about like discrete identities for characters, but also, right, that there's sort of the opposite effect, which you're kind of pointing at here, where like the natural world that we live in, right, that sense that things like are so separate, like the tropics and these things are like completely dramatically separated, and there isn't that slow movement, that liminal space you're kind of talking about. I can't speak to that part of the world, but I lived in Florida, which is dramatically different than Northwest Minnesota. But I know, having driven through that to move to Northwest Minnesota, you can sort of see the gradual shift happen in terms of the kinds of trees that are available. You can see the moment when that subtropics begins to sort of shift, and then suddenly you're in Kentucky, and it's like a completely different universe. It's like the mountains are all different, and the way the trees work is different. But there is that liminal space that kind of exists where things aren't quite either thing yet. And I love that you're bringing this up, because I think when you're talking about a place that's the Russian Far East, right? Most Americans probably know very little other than it's cold, right? Which is not accurate. It's more complicated than that. And I think your book maybe will get people to do some Googling to figure out what these places are and what's going on there. Like, I bet you if you asked, I realize I'm just rambling, I'm sorry. Because it took me years to realize that there are people of Asian descent in Russia, and like huge ethnic groups that exist there and like live in the Siberia and all of these kinds of things. And the moment I did it was like a bunch of random YouTube channels that showed up on my Google Recs, and they were like talking about living in a place that's like minus bazillion degrees, and like they have meat markets where they just hang the meat outside because it just freezes, and you can just hang it out there. And I was like, this is why I had no idea this existed. And they were like talking about that culture, and there's all kinds of interesting stuff you can learn. Anyway, I'm sorry.
There's something interesting there about borders too, and the way that borders between countries function. So I grew up in Sarnia, Ontario, in Canada. So I grew up like right on the border with the States, and even though you'd have two places that are in close proximity to one another, actually there were differences in accent, and there were other kinds of differences in culture that could be quite pronounced. I think even within people who are very very close to one another in proximity.
Yeah. That's a really big point too, that the nation you may live in, the country, could have an impact on how your culture develops, even in very similar climates and spaces. And so looking at that, like that space, the sort of Siberian space in Far East Russia, and looking at just across the border, seeing the differences that might exist there because they've been separated for generations upon generations. Yeah. That's I realize we're kind of moving far afield from the book, but I suppose I could turn it around because we're talking about research. And one of the things I was really curious about is, your bio kind of mentions some of your academic expertise. You went to the University of Toronto at the Center of Medieval Studies, which is like a really big program. You went to University of Oxford for a postdoc. You've done a bunch of very interesting stuff. You talked about the Black Death and all of these kinds of things. It's a very different setting, but I was curious about, as we're kind of talking about these liminal spaces and the different countries and borders and all of these kinds of elements that feed into this. But what was the research process like for sort of developing the world and the story of this book, and how much did your sort of academic background feed into that?
Yeah, some of the research inspiration came out of reading novels about, or nonfiction, in fact, not novels, about contemporary Russia. So I got very interested in a Russian politician named Vladislav Surkov, who was one of the masterminds around Putin's political strategy in 2016. So we had Trump, I was living in the UK during Brexit, which had a huge impact on me, and one of the reasons I ended up moving to Australia. And I got really interested in the sense of spectacle and how politicians were using spectacle at the time. I was interested in how Trump was using it, Trump as showman, but also the way that this guy, Vladislav Surkov, was using it. But he had trained in experimental theater, and he was quite deliberately using tactics from experimental theater as a way to confuse the population, to both create spectacle. They would do things like fund the opposition as well as the primary parties as well. So you could never quite tell what was going on. And eventually, so this sense, I think, really became the core of the world building, I suppose, of the setting, was why it was that politicians would become interested in circuses, in stage magic as a kind of, was really coming out of some of the theories and strategies that I was reading around what Vladislav Surkov was doing. So I drew on that, and then I needed to create a framework for it. So at one stage, at one very, very, very early novel was set in America. I think that lasted maybe 20 pages or so. So that didn't go very far before I kind of moved it and developed its own setting for it as a sort of walled off sliver country that was to some extent also inspired by Balkan states, by Bulgaria. I was reading a lot of the nonfiction by a writer named Katka Kasabova, who was talking about Bulgaria and Albania and what it is like to have these countries that were, that had hard borders, what it was like to be living in a place that had a hard border that you couldn't cross over, and what it meant to try to cross from one side of the border to the other. And I think in that sense, the notion of border became both an interesting theme in the novel, but also a good opportunity as a writer because it allowed me to develop a place that felt like it could potentially sit in the real world without me needing to reference the real world beyond a very, very small number. I think I used the word Siberia in the novel once. So there is some reference to the existence of our world within this world, but it still functions as a pretty much kind of contained universe. I feel like I might have wandered off track in terms of my answering of your questions. But I suppose the other thing then that came out of my research as an academic was I don't really think about myself as much as a medievalist these days. I sort of did a transition from being a medieval researcher to moving more directly into creative writing and working on fantasy and science fiction. One of the things that really stayed with me is an interest in the past and the way that the past influences the present and indeed also the future. And so I think that that's pretty clearly sort of woven into that storytelling technique and to that notion of cyclical history as well, or how do we break out of cycles?
Well, this
That's go ahead, Daniel. No, I'm okay. Sorry.
all the discussion of sort of borders and discrete entities and the lines separating them, but then also the overlap that exists between these discrete entities. It made me really go back to thinking of like that in some ways this is like the fantasy version of the sci-fi concept or science concept of quantum entanglement, of these discrete bodies that are entangled together in space and time, and can affect each other through vast distances and vast time, and the future can affect the past. Strangeness in that regard, which, again, I found very fascinating in here, and also impacts ideas of causality and of choice. And drawing back to the title, and when I first, the tagline for this episode, what I was reading from is actually lines from They Might Be Giants' song, Lady and the Tiger, that come from the short story, The Lady or the Tiger. And really, I haven't read that short story, but when I first heard the They Might Be Giants song, I Googled to try to figure out what this is. And a main theme of that, as I understand it, is sort of the impossibility of choice. And you see that in this novel too, and that idea of the impossibility, or at least the difficulty of choice, really fed into me in terms of that when things become entangled. And time stops acting linearly, it becomes difficult making those choices because everything is connected, everything is linked. And so I guess if I had to have a question, other than just saying I found that interesting, it would be, you mentioned sort of the inspiration for the tiger as a character, as a concept and theme. Did that then lead you to Lady and Tiger kind of concept and those themes, or was it vice versa, or did it all just kind of organically come together?
The original title for the novel when I was pitching it was The Mirabilists, and so we came to the title quite late. The short story, and I think it's interesting because choice is in some ways at the center of the novel. The novel initial premise is that Sarah has to make a choice about whether she's going to release the tiger or not, and the novel is about, really, everybody is telling stories to try to inform what that choice is and to shape what that choice is going to be. To me, that's quite interesting because when we talk about novel writing in our contemporary moment, we talk about characters having agency. We talk about characters making choices. And I think one of the things that Western storytelling is not as good at as potentially other cultural forms of storytelling is understanding that we don't always have choices, and that many of our choices are actually deeply, deeply constrained. So they're constrained by our possibility. They're constrained by our history. They're constrained by our culture. And Western novels often want to center around characters making choices and thus enacting their agency. And my novel is about that, so it's not like I was like, oh, I'm not going to do any of that. I'll just do my own thing. Clearly, I am very much doing that, but I am also interested in pushing against that a little bit, or trying to think through, do characters always have choices? What are stories about characters who have no choices like? What kinds of experiences do those reflect that maybe get left out of Western forms of storytelling?
So I guess what that made me think of is sort of a question I had in terms of how, when you read this novel now that you have written, I think one can read it and come up with lots of different interpretations. As you've said, at the heart of it, it is a novel about choices. It's also a novel about life and death, at least as I've read it. And very basically and simply the human condition, which lots of art is about, of course. But as you're reading this, there's a lot of pessimism and darkness in it. And yet also kind of like the migration, particularly with the ending, it ends with a sort of very optimistic kind of view. But I could see reading this and coming away both with different interpretations and different overall feelings of optimism and pessimism. And I wonder, as you consider your story, do you look at it sort of as, again, an entangled of many possibilities and many different interpretations, or do you really have a set kind of idea of a simple kind of version of where everything lies in your interpretation?
I think that the novel, it is quite dark. It involves people going through some pretty horrible things at times. It involves the characters making some bad choices. One of the things that interests me about storytelling is watching characters in bad places trying to make decisions. Sometimes we go to stories for escapism. Sometimes we go to stories to try to get away from things, but sometimes we also go to stories to figure out how people deal with horror and how they work themselves out of bad situations so that we can study their choices, we can learn from them, we can see characters who are broken moving towards redemption. And that was something that felt important to me about the sort of grace note ending of the novel here. Probably also with the migration. Probably that's a Helen Marshall thing. I guess at the end of the day, is I quite like doing quite bad things to my characters, um, or setting them in worlds that are not happy places, and watching them struggle towards points of optimism, moments of freedom or elation or transformation or euphoria, even. One, because I don't think that a novel should leave us with the feeling that there's no reason to do anything. I'm not pessimistic. I'm not nihilistic. I'm quite a happy, optimistic person myself. And I think that novel writing is a way to explore the darker side of the human condition, the darker side of our world, but also to work through strategies for trying to deal with it and find peace and meaning and happiness in our lives, however flawed they might be. So I suppose I don't think I have a single interpretation about it, but I am glad that that sense of optimism comes through at the ending for you.
You've given me my segue. This is just perfect.
Perfect. That's what I'm here for.
You're talking, yeah, because you were talking here, and in the very beginning, you kind of hinted at this, but one of the elements in this book and one of the dark issues that permeates the book is sort of the societal and personal impacts of war and violent conflict, which literally begins at the very beginning of our book and sort of moves through the book in a variety of ways. One of the images that sort of still sticks with me is like page 50 or something in the book, which is this amputee soldier who's doing this like really kind of macabre act for money, which I found remarkably disturbing, both because of what he's doing, but also how people react to him as he's doing this. And it reminded me of Don DeLillo in a similarly kind of twisted way, which I don't know, the Falling Man by Don DeLillo is just, I really like that book, but it's messed up, to say the least. And so I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about, or this is probably going to be one of our last questions. your sort of approach to thinking about all of the ways that violent conflicts like wars and being in war-torn spaces sort of affect family and the world that we live in, the way in which it sort of like maps itself on top of the world so that we're sort of can't really escape its impacts.
Well, the first interesting fact of that is that that particular image came from my mother-in-law. So right now I'm in my mother-in-law's house. I'm in the guest bedroom of my mother-in-law's house. She grew up in Liverpool after the war, and she said that as she in Liverpool, there would be these bombed out buildings around her, and there were all of these veterans who had fought in the war and would perform these acts of escapology for money, and so they would kind of do these magic tricks, and I thought it was such an interesting, weird detail, and I was beginning to work on the novel at the time, so it sort of got its hooks into me as something that then became one of the early scenes, and I suppose that maybe segues into my answer to the question, which is we live in these different operational realities all the time, where my mother-in-law, who was a small girl at the time going to school in Liverpool, would see these things, and these were just the fabric of life. This is just what life was at this stage, and to us it feels alien, but to her it was just what the world was. And of course then the world changes, and then the world changes again, and then the world changes again, and we see all of these relics of what the world was before that don't get entirely erased, and they sort of protrude into other forms of the world. And one of the things that I found when I was looking at Russia as an inspiration was these massive phases of rebuilding go through, where they would just kind of knock everything down and rebuild it entirely from scratch. And it is almost a kind of erasure of history. Right now I live in Australia, and I think it's very, very strange to think about the fact that, Western settlement of Australia has had such insane impact on the landscape that has probably only been there, for about 250 years. And if you go back earlier, it would have been a different culture, a different landscape. And so that everything that I see about the world as normal wasn't at all at a stage that was not very long ago versus I'm in England at the moment.
Hey everybody, so this is just a quick note that we lost some of the audio here because of internet related issues. So this little section, Helen discusses living in England and especially the town of Abington on Thames, which is one of the longest continuously settled places in the country. And as Helen says, as a result, it hasn't had the dramatic shifts in culture that you'd see elsewhere because it has had more of a gradual accumulation of culture, whereas elsewhere in the world, war and other conflicts have produced shocks of cultural change. So that just kind of helps fill the little gap right here. Thanks for understanding, and then back to the show.
You can see that this is also a result of war, and it's a result of invasion, and the way that culture changed really radically as a result of these violent confrontations.
Gosh, it is really weird to think about, so in your academic work, I realize I'm just going to ramble just for a second again, but in your academic work, you worked on the Black Death, and that's seemingly so far ago in terms of time. I mean, literally, centuries and centuries of time. And yet I feel like in thinking about your book and the way in which time and the impacts of time sort of bleed through all of our characters' stories, there's an element of that forces me to kind of think about, like, even though it seems so far away, these things from the past, like without those moments happening, everything that happens after doesn't happen the same way. And so even though I can't imagine something like the Black Death, right, having an impact on my life at this moment, I'm living in a completely different country, literally centuries and centuries and centuries later, right? At some point, you go back in time, you could probably start to see what those effects are manifest very visibly, and then they become more subtle over time, right? The fact that you're talking about the buildings, right? These bombed out buildings like being torn down and then built with new ones. Well, there's memories that are there too, right? That someone remembers that used to be so-and-so's building, or, that was a different building, or why does this building not look like any of the other ones that are around it? It's a completely different architectural style. There are ways in which those things kind of, like, the traces are left, and it's just kind of up to us to try to follow them, I guess.
These traces live in the body as well. One of the research facts I found very interesting when I was working on the migration was that the generation after the Black Death were born with 2 fewer teeth. And that it's just really interesting to think about the way that certain kinds of trauma can actually stay with us and, can change our bodies as well. And it's even interesting, the Black Death was so remote. I wrote The Migration. It came out in 2019, actual pandemic. And one of the things I'm interested in around that book was the sense that in England, the Black going on, we have Geoffrey Chaucer, for example, we have other poets writing, they don't write about the Black Death. It is this weird silence. And then hit COVID, and I thought, oh, where's all the COVID books? And nobody wants to write COVID books. Nobody wants to read COVID books. There's not very many of them. And it's in part because I think actually people do want to move on from the period. Obviously there are some, but it's not that everybody was writing their COVID book, or if they are, they sort of manifest in quite weird ways. So I think even when things don't seem to be affecting us directly, they can have strange, kind of spooky after effects.
Yeah. The COVID thing makes me think of the Tiger King show. Like everybody in my social circle mostly watched. And it is such a perfect distraction because I think it came out like weeks after COVID hit in the United States. And it was the perfect distraction, right? Here is this like ridiculously dramatic story about people who own big cats and the people that want to stop them. And they're all banana bonkers people. Let's watch 10 episodes of them being bananas. And you kind of, just for a moment, could just forget, oh, there's literally like people dying by the thousands right now because we're watching this, as he said, right? What was it, like a gay Republican who owns guns, I think is what he called himself. Like, anyway.
Well, I will say that I don't think that my novel was a COVID novel in the sense of being based on the Tiger King, though. It feels like it's maybe sitting in some of that space.
I hope not. No. It's not a Tiger King thing. Not at all. No. It's just cemented in my memory. Ah, good Lord. Those people. Yeah. It did not surprise me at like a couple years after that show came out that a bunch of them went to prison. Because I was just looking at those people going, oh, these people have committed so many crimes. There's so many crimes here. Like, they didn't catch it on camera, but they're crimes. I know it. So, yeah. And it turns out, yeah, they committed a lot of crimes and went to prison. And probably for the best. Sorry, that was a detour. Well, we got to wind down, which I'm sad to say, but we can't keep you here literally forever. Because that would be probably illegal, I think. Maybe? I don't know. So let's just start with the big one. This book is coming out, if I'm correct, it's the
June 10th.
June 10th. What month are we in? Oh yeah, June 10th. Okay.
We're in June.
I don't know
now.
where I am. Danny.
So by the time this is released, the book
will be out. And so the big question I think folks are going to ask is the one we have to ask too, which is, what are you working on next?
I'm working on a science fiction novel about people traveling to Mars in 2067 to have a citizens' assembly about our right to colonize other planets. So I'm really interested, moving away from this to, I wanted to write a version of the world that was a kind of hopeful climate change novel, like climate change, our attempts to deal with climate change, move us towards embracing social justice principles and trying to build a better society. And then how do we grapple with what we do after that? So that's the novel that I'm working on at the moment.
That sounds like that sounds very interesting, actually. I'm curious to see what that'll be, but we have to wait.
Be sure to let us know when it gets closer.
I will do.
And then if folks would like to find you and your work, where can folks go?
You can find me on the legacy of various forms of social media using the handle Manuscript Gal. I'm not sure if I could tell you which of those places is the best place because it feels as if they're constantly down and people are fleeing from one to the other. So 10 days from now, I'm not sure which of those platforms is going to be the platform. But Blue Sky seems like it's kind of fun right now. So check me out there.
You have a website too.
I do have a website. Yes. Helen-marshall.com. Another place you can find me.
Well, Thank you very much for giving us your time today. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
And I didn't put up earlier, but here is the novel. It has a really gorgeous cover, so go check that out.
It's a very cool cover. I thought, I think I described it in the alt text when I was posting about me reading the book as like an abstract style, because it's got almost like a Picasso-y thing kind of going on. Not quite Picasso, but like leaning in that direction, which I thought was a lot of fun. So, yeah. All right, for folks.
I think Titan does really great covers.
I agree. We haven't had a whole lot of Titan books sent here, but I'm not complaining because they're pretty.
We've done a lot for the blog.
For the blog, but I'm not on the blog as much because I teach 7 classes and yeah. No, it's fine. It's fine. 7 classes is just a lot. It's fine. Everything's fine. All right, for folks at home, thank you for being here. But if you'd like to let us know what you thought about this, if you read the book, or I don't know, you just want to let us know about the episode, skiffyandfanty@gmail.com is an easy way to do that. If you're in the Patreon Discord, you can also talk in there. We have a bunch of different channels for all kinds of different talking. We are on Blue Sky, Threads, Mastodon, YouTube, a whole bunch of different places. If you go to skiffyandfanty.com/skiffythings, you can find all the links to those. And remember, every Friday, 7 p.m. Central, pretty much without fail, we are on Twitch at Alphabet Streams, twitch.tv/Alphabet Streams for our live show format. And then if you like what we do, go to patreon.com/skiffyandfanty and give us like $1 if you are so inclined. We will say thank you to a bunch of Patreon supporters literally right this second. That is Andrea the Alluring, Cameron the how do you say that word, Daniel? Chthonic?
Chthonic, I think.
Okay. Cameron the Chthonic. I've never had to say it. This is my first time saying these particular names. So, Caroline the Benevolent, Carrie the Divine, Chris the Candescent, Dan the Transient, Daniel the Cultured, David the Debonair, JC the Jocular, Jeff the Gracious, Jen the Jabberwocky, Joseph the Jovial, Juan the Junctional, KB the Kind, Karen the Kickass.
Kat the Kinematic, Matthew the Magnificent, Paul the Pious, Phoebe the Eloquent, Robin the Bold, Ryan the Resilient, Sarah A. the Sensational, Sarah E. the Sublime, Sarah O. the Rapturous, Scott the Gentleman, Stephen the Strange, Terry the Thorough, Tanya the Triumphant, Trish the Imperturbable, and Victor the Valiant.
All right. Thanks, guys, for supporting the show. If you want to find me, SeanDuke.net, Alphabet Streams on Twitch, Wednesdays and Sundays, typically at 6 o'clock, except right now we're doing TTRPG stuff on Wednesdays where I play a cat. So there you go.
You can find me, Daniel, at Reading 1000 Lives on Blue Sky or my review site, and of course the Skiffy and Fanty blog. And so thank you again, Helen, for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me.
All right, as required by the Skiffy and Fanty bylaws, I'll make this happy now to end the show. And that is that, Daniel, I'm going to give you a pet tiger. And I'll leave you a choice. You can take its collar off and let it wander free into the wilderness of wherever in the Northeast you are. Or you can hang out with it in your house, but it may or may not destroy your couch.
I am always in favor of letting animals roam free and wild, so I would definitely go that route and make Western New York a wonderful place.
I mean, it could probably survive there for a while, just saying.
I'm sure, yeah.
All right. Well, on that note, happy ending and scene. If you want to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/skiffyandfanty or skiffyandfanty.com, our website, where you can get access to all of our fancy things. Our music comes from Holy Mole. You can support him and his work at patreon.com/holymole. Thank you for listening.